people welcome Jesus lovers, first of all. People are always very curious and intrigued by the question of what would Jesus do. I'd say it's not mincha gedola yet, but he would probably be davening mincha around now. To be honest with you, but the other thing that he would certainly and surely be doing would be donating to CSP, because after all, CSP is a program that is, so to speak, would be near and dear to his heart, I believe, because he was about the teaching, he was about the love, as we'll see, and he had a very interesting and complicated relationship to Jews, Judaism, and the Jewish tradition, as many of you do. So I have to say that I was around at the inception of CSP. It did not occur when an angel came down from the sky and declared that CSP would be born, but rather when Ari Katz got a bunch of people who lived in his rough neighborhood to contribute a reasonable amount of money to bring scholars. And I was one of those first scholars, and I've never looked back. It's been a true delight and an honor, moreover. I mean, there is no place in the world where you can sit in a room with 170 participants and be able to share a wide variety of ideas, from the scholarly and sober to the wild and wacky. And I find that our speakers are, by and large, always entertaining and always enlightening. And I will say one more thing, which is that Ari Katz, the founder of this enterprise, is one of the very few people that I, as curmudgeon, cynic, and general misanthrope, would account a true tzaddik. Ari has done something that very few people have done in the history of the world and the history of Judaism in the world, which is brought together a base medrash of incredible diversity and scope. And it is incumbent upon you to support it. You don't have to do everything, but you're not free simply to come and take and not support. So I really urge you to support. I do. And you should too. Anyway, today I wish to oh God, okay. I wish to share with you some thoughts, final thoughts, unfortunately, because the series is sadly coming to an end. It's been a great source of enjoyment for me, and your comments have been giving me tremendous chizuk and support. And I want to talk today about a very important, two very important concepts in the world view of Jesus. One is law, Torah, and the other, or the Torah, we talked about narrative a little bit and the influence of narrative. We'll be talking more about halacha, as it were, and you'll see why I'm designating it halacha, as it were, as we go along. And the other is love, and love is the direction in which I think that Jesus was envisioning Torah moving. And in order to really tell the story, I have to begin by singing. Oh, the master guards the sheepfold bin. He wants to know, is my sheep brung in? And he's calling, calling, calling softly, softly calling for them all to come gathering in. Oh, the master of the sheepfold, who guards the sheepfold bin, went out on the wind and the rain path, where the long night's rain begins. And he said to his hireling shepherd, is my sheep, is they all brung in? And he said to his hireling shepherd, is my sheep, is they all brung in? And the hireling shepherd answered, there's some that's wide, thin, and there's some that's got all weathered, and they won't come a gathering in. There's lost and good for nothing, but the rest is all brung in. There is lost and good for nothing, but the rest is all brung in. Then the master of the sheepfold, who guards the sheepfold bin, went out on the wind and the rain path, where the long night's rain begins, and he let down the bars of the sheepfold, calling soft, come in, come in. And he let down the bars to the sheepfold, calling soft, come in, come in. Then up through the gloom in the meadow, through the long night's rain and wind, yes, up through the wind and the rain path, where the long night's rain begins. Come the long lost sheep of the sheepfold, they all come a-gathering in. Come the long lost sheep of the sheepfold, they all come a-gathering in. This is a beautiful song. It's a traditional song. It's supposedly, from sort of spirituals from enslaved Africans, but it made its way through a variety of incarnations and changes, as these songs often do. And the song, as you can see, is about someone who's very careful about his collection of sheep and sends them off into the pasture and wants to get them back. And when it's time to get them back, he calls the shepherd that he hired and says, all the sheep in? The shepherd says, sure. And the master says, it doesn't look like that to me. The shepherd said, well, there's a bunch that, they got all lost and dirty and they're wandering and they're never going to come in. So we can forget about them, right? And the master says, no, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get those sheep, and goes out and gets the sheep himself and brings them in. Even the lost ones, even the dirty ones, even the ones of no account, brings them all in. And actually, to go back to the theme, that's what CSP does, right? It gathers a great spectrum of people of all kinds. I won't imply that anybody's lost or weathered, right? Although I feel quite weathered myself at this age. But yes, right? And a special thanks, by the way, to Rita and Bob Rubin for being here today, and I see Rita at least, and Bob may be here too. And for in whose honor this series is. I really hope I get to sit down and eat a dinner at your table at some point, as Ari has promised. But that's what it's about. It's about having a place at the table, even for the wan and, I wouldn't say thin, but scraggly lost sheep. And of course, I sang you this song, not for no reason, but because it's based on a parable, a mashal that Jesus tells. So a mashal is a way of telling stories in rabbinic culture, eventually in the Mishnah and Gemara, and in the Midrash, of course, but it was sort of floating around already in biblical times. There are mashalim, and of course, in the time of Jesus, is a way of telling stories. And in Matthew, the author has Jesus say, what do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains, go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, I'm telling you, truly, he rejoices over it more than over the other 99 that never went astray, right? So it's not the will of your Father in heaven that even one of these little ones should be lost. Luke's version, right, the author called Luke, expands this somewhat and says, so Jesus told them this parable. And Luke is always explaining what a mashal is, because Luke is, doing translating, so to speak, for a Gentile audience. And he says, which one of you having 100 sheep, making it personal? It's about you now, right? First we tell you it is a parable, right? Jesus just tells it as a story in Matthew. Luke says, now I'm going to tell you a parable, so listen up. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, doesn't leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one lost one until he finds it? And that's a rhetorical question, because probably not many of us right? We have so many sheep. What's the difference, right? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice for me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Now, you see that the story is sort of positioned differently. Matthew's story, according to New Testament scholars, is probably closer to the original wording of the parable, which is, as you know, a person who's telling a parable doesn't often say, "Now, I'm going to tell you a fable," right? Just, what do you think? Or here's a story, right? And it's about somebody else, a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and they go off, and the Jesus here assumes, in both versions, assumes that, of course, you leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one astray. But it's not a foregone conclusion, you see? So it tests you when you hear it. You say, would I have done that? Would I have done that? Right? And in the first instance, the instance of Matthew, it's about God's reaction, right, to the idea that a single person should be lost for a single second. And in the second one, it's about sort of rejoicing over sinners. Now it becomes a sinner, right? Not just a lost person, but a sinner. And there's a communal aspect, right? There's a change. And it's interesting to see how all of these stories are told and retold in the different gospels. And they are told and retold for various different purposes. But the gist here is this. The nimshal, right, the sort of solution to the parable is that the shepherd here, and in the song, the master of the sheepfold is God, and God doesn't want a single person to be left out or lost. Now, this, as we will see, is an intrinsic part of Jesus's way of teaching about the Torah, that at times he contradicts out of a sense of great urgency. And we'll see why and how that is in a second. Some of the most famous, how can I say it? The most famous episodes in the Gospels, I'm leaving this slide up now because I'm going to show you others in a second, involve Jesus's supposed conflict with the Pharisees, right? And the Pharisees are, as we said last time, they're written in as these enemies of Jesus. Right? It seems that Jesus obviously had enemies because somebody turned him over to the Romans. It seems that his enemies were, by and large, the people who were closest to the Roman government, that is, the priestly class, the scribal class in Jerusalem. And the Pharisees, the Prushim, those who separated themselves from the temple and started their own things, so to speak, or imported both the rituals and practices of the temple into their homes and created a new standard of being not only porshim, that is separate from the priestly class, right, but being mefaresh, right, being interpreters of texts. Those people much more like Jesus and who he was. As we said last time, Jesus was not wandering in the desert as an ascetic and living a monastic, quasi proto-monastic lifestyle. Jesus was not working in the temple and sacrificing sheep and goats and cows and bulls. Jesus was going from place to place, peripatetic, right, a wandering scholar whose aim was, well, to teach Torah, but to teach Torah in such a way that it lowered the bars of the sheepfold. That is, it made it possible for the rechokim, those who were far away, to be krovim, to be close, right? For those who were alienated, for those who perhaps knew less or knew little, to be included. And this had to do with a very strong conviction of Jesus, and I would say also with a character trait of Jesus. And thirdly, it had to do with the time and place in which Jesus lived. Let me begin by talking about time and place. At the time that Jesus wandered around the Upper Galilee teaching and eventually made it in the last week, basically, of his life down to Judea and Jerusalem, the idea of Jewish law, while it was present, because it is present in the Torah, had not yet gelled in the way that eventually in the mid to late 2nd century and on 100 years, let's say, after Jesus's lifetime, it would begin to gel. And so what was clear to people, Jesus included, was that the Torah said certain things, it permitted certain things, it encouraged certain things, it prohibited certain things, and it condemned certain things. I'll say that again. It permitted certain things, it encouraged other things, right? It forbade other things, and it condemned other things, right? So the Torah's attitude toward a person's life way, the path on which a person walked in the world, something that eventually would be called halacha, the Tao, T-A-O, or the going. The Torah's attitude was that there was a spectrum. There were some acts that were met with moral horror and opprobrium, certain acts that were just not to be done. It's pas nicht. We don't have to explain to you why. We just don't do them. Certain acts that, of course, you do, right? It's perfectly permissible to breathe and to eat, let's say, right? And to bathe, right? And then certain acts that it's praiseworthy or important to do, right? And those could be listed as well. But there was not a singular, gelled, or even semi-solid halacha, Jewish law as a developed entity. When we meet Jesus, and this is what's fascinating about Jesus, we're in the process of that occurring. So that if you hear that Jesus is wandering with his disciples one Shabbos in the field, and they're hungry, and some of them start to pick ears of grain that have been heated up by the sun. It's like popcorn, very delicious. And they start eating them, you would say, oh, right, that's a violation of the halachas of Shabbos. One of the 39 malachas is reaping, right? You know, picking something that's growing in a field, that's absolutely usher. And of course, if you're a modern, postmodern, from person, you can absolutely read those halachot back into the Hebrew Bible, right? Just the way that the rabbis eventually do. But in Jesus's time, it was an open question. And so when some of the Prushim, some of the Pharisees, happened to see this happening, why? Maybe they were sending spies after Jesus, maybe they happened to be in the area. The gospel writer creates this conflict, wherein the Pharisees want the law to be observed. And Jesus is about, well, if they're hungry, just let them eat. Now, the fact is that if you look at these passages, we won't look at those, we'll look at a couple of others. The fact is, if you look at those passages, it's very clear two things. One, Jesus himself does not eat in the field by picking popcorn, let's say, on Shabbos. He's mater, he's allowing his talmidim, his disciples, to do so, because he's taking a stance, and he has a raya, he has a biblical precedent. He said, well, you know, listen, when David was fleeing, you know, with his men from Saul, they were all hungry, and they even went into the temple, not the Holy of Holies, but into the holy place of the temple, and they took the bread right? The lechem upon him, the showbread that was on display all week and was not to be eaten, and they ate it. Why? Because they were hungry. It was a pikuach nefesh. It was a matter of, well, the saving of a life. Right? What happens in the case of the picking of grain on Sabbath is Jesus says to himself, I'm not going to do this. I mean, I can wait a couple hours. But these people, they're simple people. They're hot. They're hungry, right? Jesus might have made a calculation. This is not really pikuach nefesh doiches haShabbos, that an urgency, a life-threatening urgency, you're required to put aside the Sabbath. Those ideas were just in development in his period. You realize that in Jesus's time, there were people among the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, who said, if something life-threatening happens on Shabbos, Shabbos takes the top priority. The person will unfortunately have to be a martyr to Shabbos observance. And there were people in Jesus's circle, the Prushim, who said, wait a second, who's in charge here? Is the Sabbath as an abstract idea in charge of people, or are we in charge of the Sabbath? Right? Does our life take priority? Now, eventually that won out. And you know that the halacha is that if there is even a sveka de suffix, a doubt of a doubt that something could be life-threatening on Shabbos, you are not allowed to violate the Sabbath. No, you are required to violate the Sabbath, right? Now, what happens here with Jesus? Hungry people, they're hot, they're hungry. Is this life-threatening? Jesus is issuing a hora'as sha'ah, that is a temporary injunction. You know this language because of the legal profession and what's going on in the world today. A temporary injunction which permits this to happen, even though it doesn't seem to you looking at it, or to the people who are going to attack Jesus because of it, as life-threatening. And why is that? You issue a hara'at sha'ah, that is a legal injunction, when there is a pressing circumstance. So that's the first point. Let's leave it there. The first point is this. Halacha in Jesus's time was not like halacha now. And Jesus stood on the left end of a spectrum that was much broader than it eventually was, right? Because you will not find Jews nowadays, even Karaites, if you count them as Jews, you will not find them saying, if somebody is going to die on the Sabbath, you can't save them, right? Everybody agrees that the spectrum doesn't go that far to the right, right? On the other hand, everybody now agrees, or most halachically observant people agree. I'm not talking about people who say that halacha has a vote, not a veto, and we're not observant of halacha. People who are observant of halacha would say, no, you can't pick grain on the Sabbath just because you're hungry, right? So the spectrum has narrowed. That's the first thing. But even then, Jesus was on the left side of the spectrum, on the lenient side. And that was because of something very important in his character. And I hinted and alluded to this last time when we talked about healing. That has to do with his deep desire to shift religious law and obligation in the direction of a humanistic position. Right? When we think of religion, there are two main aspects, one between human beings and God. Let's call that, not that God lives in a palace in the sky, okay, but just for a mnemonic, let's call that the vertical relationship, me and God. And then there's the horizontal relationship, me and all of you. Me and all of you. Like the later rabbis, but in a more radical way, for a reason we'll see at the end, Jesus prioritized the horizontal, always prioritized the horizontal, right? This is something that you'll find, throughout Jewish history among a lot of people. I think I told you the story, maybe I didn't tell you, about the Hasidic Rebbe, that they brought him on Erev Yom Kippur, they brought him 100 chickens. You remember this? They brought him 100 chickens, and he was matir all the chickens. He permitted every housewife who came with a chicken with a shaila, right? Oh, I'm not sure this was slaughtered correctly. Is this kosher? He'd say, kosher, right? He'd almost barely look at them. And when his enemies, the anti-Hasidic faction of his own day, like those people who criticized Jesus, criticized him and said, it's impossible that there should be 100 chickens and not one of them should be treif. He said, I'd rather be makpid on lashon hara and mekil on kashrus. I'd rather pay more attention to not hurting people's feelings and saying bad things about the slaughterer, and a poor person who bought with their last coin a chicken should go hungry before Yom Kippur. I'd rather be careful about that and more lenient about the question of whether it's kosher or not. That was Jesus' attitude. Right? And that's because there's a certain sensibility in which God, and I think I said this last time, God, whatever God is a big boy, big girl, big non-binary entity, right? And God can take care of God's self. And really our task is to look into everyone else's eyes and to see the divine in their eyes and to take care of them. Because God's too big and too huge for us to take care of God. We hopefully do what God demands, right? But the priority has to be in the humanistic direction. And that's what Jesus was saying. And that is why, as we saw last time, the question of healing on Sabbath is very important in the Gospels. We had this story where there's a guy with a crippled hand, and he comes to shul on Shabbos, and there were people spying on Jesus to see what he'd do, right? Because it's not like, as I said last time, maybe I said it or not, it's not like a guy who comes to shul with a spear through his eye, right? Or a gaping wound in his chest, right? If that had happened, there might have been some Sadducees who would have said, look, we can't do anything at Shabbos, he has to die. He'll be a martyr for Shabbos. God will receive him into God's heavenly kingdom, right? And there would have been other people, probably among the Prushim or the Pharisees, who would have said, are you kidding? You got to save a life, right? The priority is human life over the Sabbath. In fact, Jesus said in the incident of the picking of the grain, he said, human beings are rulers, have priority over the Sabbath. Very much like saying pikuach nefesh doches haShabbos, right? Human need in the urgency of a life or death situation requires us to push away the Sabbath. Right? So here, this guy comes to shul, and he doesn't have a spear stuck in his eye, and he doesn't have a gaping wound in his chest. He has a hand that's crippled in some way, or twisted, or dysfunctional. When did he become crippled or twisted and dysfunctional? Impossible to say. It might have been that way from birth, a congenital issue. It might have occurred the other day, right? It might have occurred 3 months ago or 3 years ago. One thing we know for sure is that the guy isn't complaining. It doesn't say, and this is what New Testament scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. That is, if you really wanted to tell a good story, you would have a guy coming in with gaping wounds and, and screaming and crying, or his hand just got mangled, oh, there's been trouble at the mill, right? The old Monty Python routine, right? So he comes in, right, and he's screaming and crying, and Jesus says, silence, you are healed, right? And the guy is healed, right? But that's not the story. The story is the guy has a problem with his hand, right? He might have had a problem with his hand for 40 years. It's not a dramatic story. It's not a dramatic story. It's not about pain and suffering. It's just that, right? I know, somebody was saying to me the other day that they had just turned a certain age and they beginning to feel microaggressions against them on the basis of their age. And I was like, oh yeah, I feel microaggressions every single day, but they all come from my own body, right? So it's frustrating when you can't do shit that you used to be able to do, right? It was so easy to, something falls on the floor, I have to consciously tell myself to bend down because, it's a whole operation, right? And so, crippled hand may not be like, but it might be something that's constantly causing me psychological pain, social pain, right? It's something that hurts in a larger sense. And Jesus heals this person on Shabbos, right? On Shabbos. And, when they challenge him on it, he says, let me ask you, is it permitted in Mark, I'm looking at the center, on Shabbos to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And they can't answer him because the halacha hadn't yet gelled, right? Some people would have said, no, it's not permissible. Some people would have said yes. So what he's saying by asking that question is he's saying, look, we have to make a determination. And I take the authority of making a determination. And what determination does he make? He makes the determination that even though the guy isn't screaming in pain, he does not want that person for one more second to suffer. Let me repeat that again. He does not want that person to suffer for one more second, right? I think the story would be even more dramatic if they say it was almost sunset on Shabbos, right? And he cured him right there before sunset, before star rise, let's say, right? Because Shabbos is over when there's 3 stars in the sky. He cured him, right? He could have said, wait 15 minutes and I'll help you, but he didn't. And that's because there was 2 things that were more important to Jesus than the developing, not yet developed, halachas, laws of the Sabbath. One was extending the Torah in a humanistic direction. If you really believe that pikuach nefesh, that the saving of a life is doche, puts aside Sabbath observance, then put your money where your mouth is and think very broadly about what it means to have a life, right? A life of quality. And he didn't want that to be obviated for a second for the person. And also he wanted to teach something else, I believe, which is, you see what I'm doing here? There's no consensus on this issue at this moment, January 3rd, the year 30 of the Common Era. There's no consensus. And so I'm going to move the needle in a humanistic direction, and I'm going to do it dafka. Dafka is untranslatable, in a demonstrative fashion, to show you that this is how you rule, this is how you teach, not only for the sake of the teaching, not only for the sake of the ruling, but for the moral weight of your decision in that direction. This is the way a human being should act. It's very important to learn that lesson, that we can be serious about halacha. And as far as I know, my friends, Jesus was serious about halacha. He says, I don't come to change the smallest letter or the smallest crown on one of the letters. I'm just coming to enact it, to fulfill it, to do it in a way that I think has integrity. And you'll notice, right, for instance, that was when he was in the field and his disciples were eating on the Sabbath, picking grain, he himself did not pick grain, right? I'll give you one other example, and I think I gave it already, perhaps earlier in this, in these sessions, but it bears repeating. People are at a wedding, right? People are at a wedding. It's time for, because it's a Pharisee household where the rituals have been taken from the temple. And when you are in your home, if you're a Pharisee, a proto-rabbinic Jew, when you're in your home, you're in the temple. And when you sit at your table, you are at the altar. And therefore, you need to wash your hands before you eat. And so everybody washes their hands. And because it's a continuous action, they come back to the table to bless the food. And Jesus is sitting at the table. He's not doing anything. Right? Remember this? Remember this? And they say, You know how Jews are, observant Jews. They can't talk. right? It's actually not the halacha. You can talk to explain a halachic matter. Always, it's not an issue. But in general, we don't talk. And then finally, they eat some bread and they're like, Jesus, why didn't you wash your hands? And he says, oh, you people, if you worried half as much about what goes out of your mouth, rechilas, right, tail-bearing, right, lashon hara, gossip, the stuff that comes out of your mouth, if you worried half as much about that as what you put into your mouth, that it has to have a OU and an OK, and you have to wash your hands a certain way, we would all be in better shape. Now, Jesus wouldn't have been able to have that teaching moment if he didn't observe the halacha of washing hands and keeping silent, because he would just be the guy who doesn't do those things. So for Jesus's teaching to be effective, he himself had not to pick the grain on the Sabbath. He himself had not usually to be someone who ignored the rituals of temple-like eating in the home. He had to do all those things so that when on the instances that he didn't do those things, it was even more dramatic and a teaching moment. Right? So he, I think, thought very carefully about healing this person. The person didn't need immediate healing. The person could have waited. And yet Jesus said, I need to relieve this person's pain, even if it's not physical pain, and I need to teach that this is how we do it. So people often ask me, so, you're a traditionally observant Jew, you're not a Christian by any standard, you don't believe that Jesus is God or the Son of God or a prophet or the Messiah or any of those things, right? And yet you like to talk about Jesus and teach about Jesus. Why? I said, well, I keep Jesus sort of in my mind as a good left-hand parameter of what the task is, because I totally agree with and hold by the task. For me, the task is how you operate effectively within the ambit, within the 4 amos, the 4 cubits, within the designated pitching box, right, hitting box, right, strike zone, right, of halacha, and yet you orient things so that people are v'chai b'hem, that people are able to live with it, so that people are able to flourish with it, so that their humanity is celebrated. Okay, now, in one of the most famous kind of halachic / moral discussions that Jesus has with the tradition as it was developing, one case stands out very strongly. And that is the case of what we could call, or what we should call, the commandment of love. This is a very difficult commandment, probably the most difficult commandment in the Torah. It's found in Leviticus chapter 19. And it says, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. It's an interesting set of questions raised by this passage. Just look at this passage for a second. Don't read the others. I should have, staggered them, but okay, let's look at this passage. So what do you think the word love means in Leviticus? Okay, we'll talk about this in a second, right? And what does neighbor mean? And on what is the call to love our neighbor as we love ourselves predicated, right? So let's begin with the word love. Does that mean I have to be in love with my neighbor? Obviously not. But that I have to love my neighbor is a good question. And who is my neighbor? Does that mean my fellow Jew or my fellow human? Right? So you can imagine somebody with a narrow conception would say one's fellow Jew. And in fact, there are eventually halachic opinions that say that the concept of ahavas re'eh is only about the love of neighbor, is only about fellow Jews. And the idea of the love of humanity has to be read out of other places, particularly in the prophets, which say things like God says through the prophets, do we not have a single parent, all of us? Are we not from the same source, right? Or God, in one of my favorite passages in the prophets, says, you Israelites, right? You think you're so special since I took you out of Egypt? Listen, I took the Ethiopians out of Kur, and I took the Tyrians out of whatever place. I took a lot of people out of a lot of places. Remember that. right? I am the parent, God says, of humanity, right? So some people define neighbor very narrowly here. But look at the predicate. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, that predicate is very strange because, look, you're not like me. I know that because I get up every morning and I look at them in the mirror at my gorgeous face and my unparalleled physique, and I say, Professor Dr. Marc Michael Epstein, I love you. I do. Mwah. Sometimes I kiss the mirror. Yeah, yeah. Right, if that's my bicep, kiss the bicep. Yeah, I'm just like that. I'm that kind of person. But you get up in the morning, you look at the mirror, you're like, ugh, right? Now, in all seriousness, you have to love your neighbor as you love yourself. If the fact that we are, for the most part, egregiously lacking in self-love, it might mean that we're inadequate to performing this task. And this seems to be a very problematic task because this commandment is different from most other commandments, Most other commandments tell you to eat this or go here or do this or don't do that. This commandment seems to be telling you to emote. It's similar in itself to one other commandment of the Torah, which is Vesamachta bechagecha. You shall rejoice in your holiday, specifically the holiday of Sukkot. Right? You should be very joyous. That also seems to be a commandment of an emotional state. But what's the problem? Can you, should you, would you command an emotional state? You can't say be happy, be sad, right? It's always predicated on something. And so eventually the commentators say that it's impossible that is what this commandment means. They understood the commandment to rejoice in one's holiday as to eat the meat of the sacrifices, to eat roasted meat, and to drink wine. And that was ein simcha ela b'basar v'yayin. There is no quote unquote joy unless we're talking about physical things. What does it mean? There's no spiritual joy. There's no emotional joy. No, of course there is, but we can't quantify it and we can't assign it and we can't command it. Likewise here, there is no love, but if it is not emotional, that is, if it has practical implications. If you go to the third source, Talmud Bavli, Maseches Shabbos 31a, very famous story of the proselyte, the person who seeks to become Jewish, who goes before two famous sages. First, he goes to Shammai, and he says, can you tell me everything there is to know about Judaism in one session? Al regel achas. Al regel achas means in one session, but regel, right, session, right, or instantiation or instance, right, has as its root the idea of a leg. So the story is, that he went to Shammai. He says, tell me everything there is about Judaism while I'm standing on one foot. And the idea is that Shammai thought that this was terribly problematic and it was a mockery. And he picked up the ruler that he kept on his desk and he chased him out. And so the proselyte went to Hillel and he says, tell me everything there is to know about Judaism in one fell swoop. That's how we would say it, in one fell swoop. Hillel said, get on your foot, stand on one foot. Right? The guy's standing on one foot. Hillel said, you ready? The guy says, I'm ready. I can, the New York Times always has these articles. Can you stand on one leg for 30 seconds? Right? That's a measure of your health. So the guy is like, he's a Roman. He's eating lark's tongues and going to the vomitorium, right? So he can barely stand on one foot, but he's standing on one foot. Hillel says, you ready? The Roman guy says, yeah, I'm ready. Hillel says, are you sure? The guy says, don't screw with me. Please tell me. Hillel says, listen, if it bothers you, don't do it to anybody else. Roman guy says, what? Hillel, if it bothers you, don't do it to anybody else. That's the whole Torah. The rest is all commentary. Now get on the other foot and go and learn. Right? What's hateful unto you, don't do unto others. That's the whole of the Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. So when I first learned this passage in a liberal Jewish setting, they always said, what is hateful unto you, do not unto others. That is the whole of Torah. The rest is commentary. But then when you open the Gemara, it obligates you, or it obligates the Roman, to go and actually learn it. You can't just say the rest is commentary. So Hillel said, crazily enough, that everything in the Torah, from not mixing wool and linen, to not eating milk and meat, to not making a stone ramp up to your altar, right? Stairs up to your altar, but a ramp. All of that is to be oriented in what direction? Not a vertical direction, even when it seems like it's about you and God. Oh no, in a horizontal direction. And it has to be a smooth horizontal. If it's hateful to you, don't do it to anybody else. That's what the Torah is teaching. Now, that's exactly what Jesus was teaching on a good day. Remember? Right? Remember? Human life, more important than the Sabbath. Alleviating human suffering, very important. Letting down the bar of the sheepfold. We'll talk about that again in a second. Everything comes round in these talks, right? Letting down the bar of the sheepfold. That was what was important to Hillel and also to Jesus. But here's the last thing about Jesus and law. Jesus had a bug in his ear. And that bug was the fact that he felt like Andrew Marvell in his coy mistress, at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, right? An urgency, because in a second, in less than a second, it will happen. And what is the it? That the Roman Imperium, the occupation, will be replaced with Basilio Toteo, the divine imperium. God will be the emperor. Malchuta Dishmaya, not Malchuta Dabshmaya, not the kingdom which is in heaven, like a Disney castle on a cloud someplace, but Malchuta, the rule, Dishmaya, of heaven, meaning God. God's direct imperial rule is coming. And therefore, we can't simply do what Hillel did, let down the bar, because we need to do something radical, because the world is changing. Hillel espoused a prophetic model. One day, things will be different. We're moving toward that day. Jesus espoused an apocalyptic model. Now, in my family, there's a famous story told about cousin Beatty and her annoying son. And her annoying son was annoying somebody. And I forget what Beatty's husband was, my mother could say. And he's beaten up somebody, and Beatty says, "You stop that this instant. When we get home, I'm gonna kick the crap out of you." And her husband says, "Now, Beatty, now." Right? So now was Jesus's word of the day. Now, Basilio Tote, divine, right? So Jesus says something astounding. He says, you've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, right? It's fine to love you. You should love your neighbor, and it's okay to hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your parent in heaven. God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. This has a parallel in a midrash, famous midrash about Alexander of Macedon, which I won't go into right now. If you love those who love you, what's the point, right? Even tax collectors, the most despised element in society, they love people who love them. And if you greet only your own people, That's a critique of neighbor. What are you doing more than anybody else? Don't even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Why? Because God's imperial kingdom is dawning, and you need to get right with God now. So Jesus's relaxed attitude at times, like this time, when the commandment itself is about love of neighbor, he amplifies it. He makes it very, very high bar. You don't only have to greet other people and tolerate them, and you don't only have to love people who are like you or part of your ethnos, your religious cultural circle. Even your enemies you need to love. You need to bring them in so they're not enemies anymore. Now look at the contrast between that apocalyptic sensibility toward this halacha, toward this law, and Hillel's prophetic sensibility. There's a problem with Hillel. It's very clear. Hillel doesn't move anybody to do great things, right? Doesn't move. It just says, if it bothers you, don't do it. Don't do it. Do no harm, right? But here's the thing. What Jesus says creates tremendous angst, right? Jesus says you have to love your enemy. If you don't love your enemy, you're not doing a commandment to the Torah, an essential commandment of the Torah. People are like, oh shit, I can't do it. How can I love my enemy? Therefore I can't do commandment, therefore I'm a sinner, right? Hillel makes nobody a sinner. If you came to Hillel and you said, look, I can barely get out of bed in the morning, let alone love myself, have enough self-respect that I can love others. What should I do? Hillel says, calm down. Don't worry. I'm letting down the bars of the sheepfold. Everybody's in. Basically, if you don't hurt other people, you're not a sinner. Don't worry. And then somebody else comes to Hillel and says, I have this crazy idea. I want to be hyper frum. I want to get right with God. I want to love my enemies. What does Hillel say? You're a little crazy, but geh gesundheit. Go ahead. That's fine. That's great. It's laudable, maybe, right? But don't leave this other guy over here, this other gal over here, this other non-binary person over here. Don't leave them out of the equation just because they can't get it up to even love themselves, right? Be patient, be tolerant, let down the bar. That's a very Jesus-like approach from what we've been seeing, right? But here, Jesus raises the bar. And the problem with Jesus' statement here is that unless God is coming into the world in the next moment, which it turned out did not happen, the Romans continued to be the masters of life and death in Judea and in the north, right? Unless that's happening, right, that God is taking over, right, it's a very high bar. And it's well nigh unachievable, and it can be frustrating. So to summarize the attitudes toward law and love, law was important for Jesus, but it had not coalesced in the way that it has now coalesced. So we have to be gentle on Jesus if he seems to be violating or breaking the law. It was not his stated intention. Secondly, Jesus's impulse was to move law in a humanistic direction at all times, something we would do very well, even the most firm among us, to learn, right? A great rabbi of ours in New Haven, Connecticut, now in Canada, Rabbi Michael Whitman, once solved a halachic problem for us. And when we expressed surprise because we were Balei Tshuva, we were returnees to Judaism, and we wanted to be very strict on ourselves, he said, you know what? It's easy. It's easy to be makpid. It's easy to be strict. You just say no. What's hard is to be makil. What's hard is to get to yes. So that's something we can learn from Jesus. And finally, we have to understand that Jesus's attitudes toward law, even when pushing it in humanistic direction, could be prejudiced or tinkered with by his apocalyptic sensibility. His sensibility that the world was changing, it was moving in the direction of God and God's imperial rule. And therefore, even the humanistic orientation of law had to be amplified. So that, my friends, is what I have to share with you. 1 second. Let me get out of this. That, my friends, is what I have to share with you today about Jesus' law and love. I'm going to look in the chat. We have a few minutes and see questions and comments, and maybe some other things about the whole series. Yes, yes, Table, As a Driven Leaf, a story of Elisha ben Abuya, was published by Berman House, correct? Right. Okay. Thank you to everyone. Yes, Jesus was of the school of Hillel, David, as we see. The Pharisees were not of the school of the Shammai; they were of the school of Tzadok. They were not. I mean, Shammai's opinion. They might have been temperamentally, some of them, like Shammai, but they were also. I have not watched The Mandalorians. If Jesus were a practicing Jew who lived today, where would he and his teaching philosophy fit, says Edward, within the spectrum of today's Jewish societies? He'd be a halakhically observant Jew on the far left. But it's unclear whether he were alive today, he would have continued to exist completely on that left end of the spectrum within halakhic observance. If halakha moved, toward the right, which it did, and it cut off the far left and the far right and became a centrist entity, would he have been more centrist? One can't say that, right? Thank you. Right. Pharisees and Sadducees, some of the Pharisees were of the same mind of Jesus, some of them were his enemies. There was a spectrum of belief. Think of the Pharisees as halachic Jews today, let's say, right? There are some who think that it's a mitzvah to settle the land of Israel, and some who think it's the biggest of error, it's the biggest sin to settle the land of Israel, right? Until the Messiah comes. So, among the Pharisees, there was a wide range of opinion. And probably the people who didn't like Jesus, it wasn't so much about actually what he did with the law or not. It was probably about whether this is good for the Jews or not, and how it looks in front of the Romans. Because among the Pharisees, there were people who were very ardent supporters of the Romans, a small group, and there were people who were very, very little less. Had Jesus never been down to Judea before that last week of his life? Depends who you ask, right? The Gospels place him there in Bethlehem, and then he goes up to the north, and then he comes back. But most New Testament scholars think of him as someone who spent most of his life in the Galilee. When did Jesus' followers hijack his message and start persecuting other Jews? Pretty soon after, in the writings of Paul around the year 60 or so, the earliest writings in the New Testament, Paul is already somebody who is trying to repress not other Jews, but repress the Jesus movement. That's not what you asked, right? Once the Roman Empire became Christian, then it was more of an open question of what you did with the Jews. Montreal, Michael Whitman. Yeah, we love him. We love him. Thank you for your kind. Rebecca Emmerich says, can you give an example of how you keep Jesus in your mind when you're living within the ambit of halacha? Yeah, I always ask the question, how can this act that I'm doing, this religious act, bring me closer to other people? Because it's in other people that I'm going to see the divine, right? Because to me, at least, God doesn't appear in a cloud, in a ray of light, right? I see the divine in other people. So how can this act that I'm doing bring more people into my experience, and therefore give me more experience of the divine? So for instance, I don't, if I invite people for the Seder, right? I do so in the knowledge that some people might drive, right? But I think that that's their decision. They understand that. I always offer them a place to stay. If they refuse a place to stay, then their violation of the law of driving, let's say, on the holiday, right, is their own business. But I think that it's very important that they not be somewhere on their own, that they be in contact with other people. And that brings a more humanistic dimension to things. So sometimes I opt for those kinds of questions and solutions. Okay. Thank you for your thank you. Some excellent questions that are a little long. Would be long in the answering. Let's see. Does Jesus get an inappropriate bad rap by Jews today? By some. I guess it just depends how scared you are of Christianity or of Jesus. You know, I'm someone who's very kind of firm in my Jewish beliefs and practices, and it's not a question. Like, I can read whatever I want, and it doesn't make me think, oh my goodness, Jesus, it says in this book, you know, that Jesus raised this person from the dead. Maybe Jesus is X, Y, Z. It never even occurs to me. Right? It's not my thing. So, you know, but maybe some people are threatened and therefore, you know, have issues. So do you see Jesus as eschatological preacher? Wait, let's see. I just lost you. One second. Oh no. Oh boy. My trackpad froze. 1 second. I can't. Oh, okay. Good. Do you see Jesus as an eschatological preacher on the level of John? He seems much more laid back on the matter comparatively. Well, he's not a prophet. He's an eschatological preacher. I mean, you know, John in Revelation, the character called John, you know, tells the story of fire falling out of the sky and locusts and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. You don't have to be, you don't have to tell stories like that to be apocalyptic. Apocalyptic means that the denouement of history, the end of history, is coming, and that's totally what Jesus was about. For Isaiah, the denouement of history was somewhere in the distant future, but for Jesus, the denouement of history was here. And now, okay, yes, Amy Jill would probably like some of the things I say and disagree with some of the things. Thank you all for this class. Oh, John the Dipper. I mean, also, you know, the next dipping is going to be in fire. You know, Jesus says a couple of apocalyptic fire and brimstone things, but it's generally when he's getting angry or wants to make a point. But in general, his apocalypticism, as you point out, is a low-grade apocalypticism, which is more apocalypticism than most of us experience in any case, right? You know, when we think about what's going to happen, unless we're somebody who's standing on the street corner and trying to, you know, explain that the apocalypse is going to be tomorrow, we generally think of it as something in a deferred future, you know, not right now. Okay, super. That was a lot of questions. Sophia, would you like to wrap up?
Thank you very much. I think you covered a lot of the good questions, and it was a really special four sessions program. Very, very special. We will send out. We will share Marc's notes, and I will add a few notes, and you'll get the recordings of the past sessions if you'd like to view them. Thank you very much again. And we hope to see you soon again at CSP.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you. Great to see you. And maybe we can continue this discussion or another one at any time. Just let Ari know if you're interested. See ya.
Exactly. Let Ari know. And please contribute to our drive.
What would Jesus do?
Okay. Jesus would. Thank you, everyone.